Hello everyone, my name is Rahul Kapoor. I'm a Partner Innovation Enablement Specialist at ABBYY. In this video, we are going to talk about Vantage APIs. To be able to process document via the Vantage REST API, you need to get an authentication token. To do this, the first step is to create a Vantage REST API client. Then select one of the three available authentication methods that are Resource Owner Password Credentials or ROPC. This is one of the fastest and easier, but less protected. Or another method is authentication code flow, which requires an extra step during authentication, but is considered the most secure option. The third is client credential flow. This flow is particularly suitable for machine-to-machine applications, including your application or backend services, as it enables the authentication and authorization of the application itself rather than of a user. Let's discuss the first method in more detail. To create a Vantage client, you need to open the tenant administration window and click on the Create API button, as you can see on the first screenshot. Then in the dialog box that opens, the client ID and client secret of the created client will be displayed. You can save these values by clicking on the icon next to them. Alternatively, you can click the Save to File button, then specify the location where the text file containing the client ID and client secret values will be saved. The client is created now, and you need to specify the allowed authentication methods. We'll discuss the schemas in more detail now. We are going to talk about resource owner password credentials in this video. This authentication method is relatively simple and allow the external application to log into the Vantage system by directly processing the username and password instead of a browser. Here's the example request, which is highlighted in the blue, must be exactly the same as in the sample. Do not change this parameter. The email ID and password highlighted in red are your credentials. You have created the client ID and client secret as the previous step while creating a client. Now, in the request body parameters, grant time will be the password that specify the password grant type is used, so it will be the text password as it is. The scope would be OpenID permissions global.wildcard. This specifies the permission scope. The user and password will be your credentials. The client ID would be the client ID created by the tenant admin on the configurations tab. Client secret would be the secure application key created by the tenant admin on the configurations tab. The server's response will contain an access token that you will need later. Now we'll see in Postman how you can use the Vantage API yourself. Now to start with, we'll start from the configurations tab, and I will go to the public API client option. I'll create a new client. This is the client ID, client secret we have. I'll save it to file. When creating client, you need to make sure the correct authorization setting is selected. Since I'm using resource owner password credential, that's why I've enabled allow ROPC flow. So next step is to generate a token. We have the documentation available in ABBYY Vantage documentation option as well, where you can already see the sample request. I'll just click on copy. I will paste in my Postman. So here it has already created a post request to the Vantage EU tenant, the tenant that I am using. I can see the different headers and body. The grant type, as I mentioned, would be password. Scope would be OpenID permissions global.wildcard. The email ID would be my email ID that I'm using. And the password would be my login password to Vantage tenant. Client ID and client secret would be the client ID and client secrets that I created in Vantage admin screen. Now, one important thing to note here is if your email ID is connected to multiple accounts, then you need to add your tenant ID with the post request. You can find the tenant ID under the tenant administration option in general. So I have my tenant ID here. So I have my request completely compiled now. I will click on the send button. Now my request is complete in Postman, and I have received the access token back from the API. I will copy this access token here. Now I have the access token. I can now start processing my documents with Vantage API. Now, there are two ways to process your documents, either through a single API call or through multiple API calls. Through single API call, you can process one document at a time. While using multiple API call, you have an option to keep on uploading multiple documents to the same transaction to process multiple documents together in a single transaction. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use the first option where I'm processing the document in a single API call. So click on new request or paste the request to get the list of all available skills. I'll copy the token that I have. I've added the token in the authorization tab and I'll click on send. This will give me a list of all available skills that I have in my tenant. From the list of skills that I have received back from the API, I have selected the invoice processing skill, and this is my skill ID for that. I'm going to use this skill to process my document. Next step in the flow would be creating and starting a transaction. So I'll click on create a new request, and I will call the Vantage API again to process my document. Now I have to provide the skill ID. As a body, I need to send the file that I want to be processed. So I'll upload a new file from my local machine. The authorization would be bearer token. It has created a transaction with this transaction ID. Now I can go to Vantage in skill monitor in the transactions tab and see the transaction has already finished. It took 11 seconds for the transaction to process. You can also monitor the transaction through API. So I need to provide the transaction ID as a parameter. The authorization would be bearer token again. I'll click on the same button. And you can see here the status of the transaction is processed and we have the result JSON available. The next step would be to download this JSON file. To download the result file, you will need the file ID, which you will get here. Next, I will download the result file. You can see I have the transaction ID and file ID in my request. I'm calling the download endpoint. I have the authorization selected as bearer token with my token. Click on send button. And it will give me the output JSON that we get from Vantage. Of course, you can switch to the field only JSON where you get only the key value pair instead of all the metadata that you get from the output. Thank you.